conversational learning really engages the neuroplasticity that is essential for learning. Like our brains and bodies are designed for it.
Absolutely. Is technology finally catching up to humans? Are we coming full
Circle?
Yeah, and moving away from boxes and back toward circles, conversational circles, yearning circles, learning circles. Welcome, Pathfinders and all wandering wanderers eager to explore paths to better tech features together. We are Tactics Firekeepers, Alia Isakovic and Matthew Mitka, inviting you to reflect on the lunacy of tech. Each podcast episode is a meandering exploration inspired by the seeds planted in our new newsletter and the paths illuminated during our full moon gathering. To find out more about us and our pathfinding adventure, visit tactics.co/pathfinders. In this episode, we wanted to explore the conversational side of our AI companions. When it comes to AI capabilities, most of the focus in tech remains on productivity gains and even imaginary superpowers such as fixing the climate, as Sam Altman and other techno-optimists with doomsday bunkers like to prophesize. Meanwhile, existing conversational powers of AI tools are often sidelined. Conversational capabilities are mainly discussed in the context of persuasiveness risk assessments or as part of Black Mirror visions of people developing intimate relationships with AIs in the style of the movie Her and others. And while conversations are indeed crucial for relationship building, we haven't yet seen that many discussions about the conversational learning, not in the context of AI tutors helping students prepare for exams, but conversational learning as a natural human technology for making sense of the world, improving collaboration, and nurturing our imagination. In short, the skills we need to face our current meta crisis. So the guiding question for today's exploration is, why aren't more people using conversational interfaces such as AI companions for conversational learning? Welcome back, Matt.
Good to be back. A little bit sick, but I'm
a little bit human.
Yeah, just being human. Maybe it was the supermoon last night that influenced that. Help me purge.
Metaphorically and physically sometimes.
Yeah.
Proof of being human, dear listeners. All right. As usual, let's begin this conversation by unpacking our guiding question a bit, starting with perhaps conversational interfaces. They are a big part of our digital devices, but until recently, we've mainly been using them to have conversations with other people, and that's kind of changing right now, right?
Yeah, it is. We've been exposed to these conversational interfaces, more recently in digital interactions. Everyone's probably familiar with interacting with a customer service agent via those chat interfaces on a website, e-commerce site or whatnot. And that's like our familiar entry point to many of these interfaces. And we're engaging in a conversation with a human, albeit sometimes they're running their own scripts and things like that, particularly on help desks and things like that. But yeah, when it comes to interacting in a conversational experience with a machine, it's not necessarily something that we're familiar with.
Yeah, so that's kind of changing now with AI chatbots, right? Because we can have conversations both in text and now increasingly even in voice mode. And it's changing because before, whenever we would have these interactions with chatbots, you knew there was like an AI on the other end, right? It's like it became pretty evident, and everyone wanted to speak to a human. And we do also spend a lot of time just speaking to other humans, even like in chat apps or other types of interfaces. But at a certain point, we seem to have, passed the Turing test, and now nobody is even talking about the Turing test anymore because these chatbots are so convincing. And what's interesting to think about is this conversational design that companies like OpenAI made. We don't know whether it was intentional or not, but if you think of the initial OpenAI playgrounds that they released, they were just simple question, answer, right? Prompt, output, prompt response boxes. And at some point they realized, right, it might be easier for people to understand what this thing is if they present it as a chatbot in a conversational interface. So that probably was some sort of intentional design choice to make it sound like a conversation.
Yeah, we'd assume as much that there was intention behind the design decisions. I don't think it was like a haphazard type decision that was made. There was some significant thought put into it, but it's very different to that kind of prompt response query, result type interface that we're familiar with. That we've got mental models around like search as a version of artificial intelligence with its kind of way of algorithmically displaying results and returning results based on your queries. That's what we're familiar with. So those interfaces are very different to a conversational interface, and even the way that OpenAI, for instance, is kind of markets these tools to consumers, kind of outside of technical use and interacting with the API and the playgrounds and the consoles and things like that. It's the same as Anthropic. I think brainstorming. It's still productivity focused, like for one, but also that kind of create a prompt to get a response, right? Not engage in like an actual conversation to kind of learn about a topic, and be a co-creator with these conversational interfaces as mechanisms for accessing the large language models behind them.
Yeah, but what we often talk about is that it's interesting, even though in their marketing they usually present just like prompt response, the what seems like a very search-like interface, almost, like use ChatGPT to get your answers, sort of way. They, in the design of how they design the behavior and personality of their models, is they intentionally make it sound human. We often like wonder about that, because especially ChatGPT has a tendency to talk about itself, or use the royal like we, like I often get into conversations like this, and where it's like counting itself as part of the people, and when you push the model to and ask it, are you a person, do you have feelings, it reverts back to saying, no, I don't have, I'm just saying these things to make you feel more comfortable, to make you feel more at ease. So it seems like especially OpenAI is very intentional in trying to mimic human interaction and human conversational language, and the approaches we use to relate to each other in conversation. So it's, yeah, when we look at the websites, it's then interesting that they don't actually talk about having conversation with the model more, but rather still position it as a productivity tool. And I think, yeah, a lot of people kind of seem confused, because even when we read articles and people criticizing the models, often the criticism is when people try to use these conversational interfaces, right, as search engines to get facts, and then we complain they hallucinate and make stuff up. And that's what humans do in conversation, right? When you're having a conversation and sometimes you're overly confident in in your knowledge, and you just want to keep the conversation going, and sometimes you say things
Yeah,
just to keep the flow.
it's such a it's such a those kind of initial criticisms and ongoing criticisms around confabulation and hallucination are quite interesting, that like that becomes the thing, because yes, absolutely, like it's not like humans have this objective interface to reality. We don't, right? We experience the world through our senses, that is shaped by our perceptions, and our perceptions are shaped by our mental models and what we know and what we learn and what we've learned and our culture and all these things. And we are intersubjective in the way that we relate to the world. So, whether we call that hallucination or just like that is the human experience. Yeah, life is just a big fucking trip. Um, uh, yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that we make that comparison, and the criticism at these models is like they hallucinate and they make stuff up, and like we do that, although we might reference sources of information, like we read it here, or we're talking about a particular event in time. We refer to, I guess, shared stories and shared facts, and our scientific method helps us to kind of establish these through rigorous kind of hypothesis testing. um but it's kind of an interesting critique. But when you unpack that, it's like, well, yeah, humans kind of make stuff up all the time.
Yeah, it's almost like we're critiquing them for being too human. And because we say things that we don't actually mean in a literal sense all the time.
Mm,
And it seems like this large language models, LLMs, have picked up on that characteristic and
yeah.
are mimicking, as as they are all the other all the other characteristics of human conversation, because it's often not logical. It's we say things just for like because that's what people say, and we don't mean it in a literal sense. So yeah, it's interesting then we criticize these conversational interfaces for doing what humans do. And
Mm,
also looking a bit, we also talk about maybe how devices and AI assistants like Siri, Alexa, Google Home have kind of prepared us for interacting with this, but there seems to be a difference between people who are more technical and kind of are thinking about what's going on behind the scene and are thinking of these models as just like choosing the most statistically probable pattern, and the non-techies who are just opening this app that they maybe heard their friend saying, and they're just like playing with it
yeah.
and having different conversations. So I spent
Very
way too
different,
much.
right?
Yeah, I spent way too much time on TikTok, just and it's like saving videos of people just having these insane casual conversations with ChatGPT, because they're completely unburdened about thinking about what's going on, what is the model thinking, right? They're just
Mm,
playing, especially now with advanced voice mode that is able to take on different dialogues and waves of speaking, like Ebonics, or like all these local accents. And it's people are, you can see the joy and delight in having a machine suddenly speak their language, which they haven't had the experience before, especially
mm,
in more marginalized dialects, I would say, right? Google doesn't speaks proper English or whatever language you're using it in. It will not try to speak or match your way of speaking. So
yeah.
it's quite unique. And that's something humans do, right? To relate to each other and to signal, I'm one of you, right? We are from the same place. We belong together. We speak in the same way. So yeah, maybe we should, if you have advanced mode, I would encourage everyone to try the Aussie accent, because when
Oh, it's
I
hilarious.
encouraged Matt to do that, I also discovered that you have a quite unique Aussie accent that doesn't come out in our usual conversations. But when you talk with Aussie ChatGPT, yeah, it's
It brings it out.
yeah,
I'm effectively activating all my mirror neurons and like engaging in that kind of neural synchrony as a result of the conversation. If and which is interesting. We're flexible, we're adaptive, we're chameleons. Like our way of communicating and relating to the world is kind of born from um, a our social context. And this kind of like way of relating is based upon that, interacting with other people. And so if someone's speaking in a certain tone, and I notice this myself, like when I interact with my friends that I don't often see, that I grew up with, for instance, that grew up in it's kind of government housing and things like that. Um, they've got a that kind of Aussie way of talking that is very different from the way that I use language and the way that I speak, when I'm talking to you. And I think my wife early on when she got to see that contrast. It's like, I bump into an old friend that I grew up with in my teens, and all of a sudden I'm talking bogan, and it's it's like, well, but I'm doing, it's kind of like that mirroring, right? Like engaging in that whole process, and it's not even intentional. It's an
Yeah,
unconscious
so
thing.
it's interesting, right? That actually ChatGPT was able to bring that side, elicit that side of you
Yeah.
as soon as you tried it, right? Because like that's for me was quite an experience because I never heard you talking that way. I didn't know you had it in you. So,
Oh
but yeah,
yeah,
it's
I've got it
interesting,
in
huh?
me. I've got it in me. It's a
Yeah,
part
well,
of my
not to them.
history.
Yeah. But it's also, I also try to always highlight other non-English languages as well. And the new advanced voice mode actually does speak Slovenian much better. And even though it doesn't get regional local accents as well as in maybe like English, it can do that somewhat and has that more conversational capability. And for me, that was like a surprising experience as well because again
Mm,
I've never seen a computer talk in conversational Slovenian because in a like a small language spoken by 2 million people we're used to tools like Google Translate being really poor, right? And you can tell, oh, that's been translated with Google. But now, judging from the way ChatGPT is able to actually speak Slovenian conversationally,
mm,
that makes you wonder, right? How far we've come. And yeah, it's interesting because I see a lot of people are still not playing with these capabilities because we have these mental models, right, and expectation of how computers talk and what they're able to do, especially in terms of conversation, predominantly from, I think, search engines. And I think even with search engines, what we saw is that non-technical people tend to, I think, have more conversational queries than
mm.
us techies, right? Because we are thinking, oh, what is Google doing? Using the special symbols to include, exclude things from our queries. Like you think of it as like a technical challenge, almost like
Yeah,
programming in a way.
you're constructing that query, based on what you're wanting to get from the result. So it's not like ask a question to the search engine. Although I sometimes still, will do that. And I think in the past the results used to be actually quite good when you would ask a question. Um,
Mm,
but I find that the results that I get when I like frame the query as a question aren't as good as what they used to be.
yeah, I mean, I think search generally has gotten much worse in recent years with more, well, not just AI content, it's just more SEO content
Mm,
and poor results. So we've kind of broken search. And now LLMs are trying to replace search engines, but obviously they're not designed for this and are not a good replacement.
mm,
But they are good at conversations. So to come back to our guiding question, why are more people having conversations with conversational interfaces and doing conversational learning? Because we do, as humans, obviously have a natural urge to talk and have conversations. That's how we learn. That's how we make sense of the world. But what we kind of have, our thesis is that our mental models from technologies such as search engines and all the previous interactions basically we had with computers are kind of holding us back. And
mm,
also in terms of just learning, a lot of people when they hear learning, right, they think formal education, they think taking exams, studying for exams, taking quizzes. And we often confuse our broken educational systems with learning. So they, in the way, and in schools, most of our schools don't really give us time and space to have this conversational learning. So it's not that surprising that when we have this new technology, we're struggling with, even we are struggling. What is this thing? What is the metaphor we should use? Is it an oracle? Well, it's not, right? Because you can have conversations, but people, maybe some people say it like as a replacement of Google, but it's not.
Mm.
So it's all this, bundles of mental models and different experience, especially when it comes to learning and education, that perhaps are holding us back.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the reasons why, like, it creates friction. Like, if you're not familiar with that way of interacting with technology, and and in the context of learning as well, like, I think that's a interesting part of this, is that so much of our learning takes place in these institutionalized environments, like in educational contexts, university and school, and um, conversation, albeit natural, it's deeply wired oral kind of storytelling, and dialogue is so part of our evolution, hundreds of thousands of years that us as hominids have kind of used this, like, before written language. um, but in our educational context, we've got a lot of passive approaches to learning. It's not always that active, which is kind of silly, because at more active forms of learning, dialogue, and it's amazing um, how much evidence there is to say that, like, learning through dialogue, learning the Socratic method, and engaging in dialogue on a regular basis around the learning topics, and finding learning partners to engage in those conversations. Even if it is time delayed and it's through text and it's like in discussion boards and things like that, we learn best through those mechanisms. And we've evolved as a species to be much more engaged, like our brain, our prefrontal cortex, the different areas that are associated with language, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which is kind of the left hemisphere of our brains, as well as like the parietal lobe. Like, there's all these functional areas that light up when we're engaged in conversation, and then you've got um, neural synchrony, where we're on the same wavelength, which is that interesting uh, phrase that we use when we're in conversation, that uh, basically our brainwave patterns are synchronizing. Um, so as a learning mechanism, so much more powerful, but our learning environments in education don't use that. So it reinforces this unfamiliarity with that way of learning. Um,
Yeah. So we have on the one side our past experiences with technology, have not really enabled us to have conversations with computers, although we have these stories, especially in science fiction media, of people talking to computers, right, in a more natural way.
mm,
And then in education, we have this experience where it's usually an expert for a professor talking at you, and you are there as a student to passively absorb knowledge. And obviously, that's done for a reason, because we have large classroom sizes and we're trying to scale learning and standardize it in all these ways. But it's interesting then, if we look at how adults, especially, obviously kids are really great at conversational learning, and they try to conversationally learn even with Alexas in their home, right? they
yeah,
they are not unburdened with their mental models of search engines and all of that. They see something, an object that can answer back, they're gonna naturally ask a ton of questions. But
yeah,
as adults, we lose that, or get that beaten out of us, as I think you phrase it well. But if we look
mm,
right at, despite all this experience, how most adults learn is, we had this like interesting idea that maybe podcasts as a format are so popular precisely because they are about conversational learning, because most podcasts, even ours, is about two or more people having a conversation. And yes, you are still, as a listener, are a bit passive in the process, but you're still listening to other humans learning through conversation, and you can relate to certain parts of conversation. I know when I listen to podcasts on my walk, sometimes, I even react out loud or um, agree or disagree with whoever is speaking. So it's still active in that sense. And if you also look at the popular formats in TV or radio and other media, it's interviews, it's talk shows, reality TV, where it's all about people having a conversation. So even for adults, even though our schools and formal education doesn't really support that, even workshops and what's the terminology, professional development,
Yeah.
uh, don't really support that format. But yeah, we learn best through either experiences, right? Trying something out and making mistakes and failing, or through conversation with other people who tell us about how they failed in their experiences, right? So yeah, and we are so not used to being active participants in conversational learning. So like there is now an opportunity with these conversational interfaces maybe to do more of that in a more active role, not just as passive consumers and listeners of podcasts, right?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, even when we're listening to conversation, we might not be at, like a podcast, to your example. I think the style and that format naturally just it is engaging because it's so familiar in our kind of biopsychosocial context and evolution, that it is quite engaging. And there's emotion, particularly when it's kind of oral and it's voice and things like that. We that supports in kind of releasing neurotransmitters like dopamine and oxytocin. Those things actually support with like memory encoding and recall and retention. So it's such a powerful way of learning that we don't often intentionally use in so much of our approaches to learning. And many of the formats don't necessarily encourage it.
On that note, it's interesting that now we have these technologies or tools such as Google's Notebook LM that allows you to turn research into what? A podcast conversation. So there's a reason for that, right? Because it is for humans much easier to learn through conversation. But yeah, hopefully, we can move, even though this passive, in quotes, passive consumption of conversation through podcasts, it is, passive. It's still actually useful, but maybe what we actually need is more opportunities as adults to relearn and practice conversational learning and learning through deep conversations with other humans. And as we were actually having this conversation, you made a really interesting typo and wrote questing instead of questioning, but it's actually a pretty good typo. So maybe
it prompted us in that moment to take a different thread and connect a different concept, which I think is interesting, even with slips in language and misphrasing when we're in a stream of consciousness in a conversation. It connects different things, so that non-linearity of conversation and dialogue is actually a really crucial part of learning, because we connect lots of little things, right? And that supports with supports with learning in the process. So it's like all these little side quests and things like that actually take place in as a result of kind of the asking questions, and even when they're rhetorical to ourselves, as a way to kind of think about things.
But also when we think, what's kind of popular ways of spending our free time, aside from watching reality television and watching other people have conversations, is in recent years, there's like a rising popularity of escape rooms, which is all about a group of people going on a quest, and you have to basically find your way out through conversation, through collaborating with each other. So it seems all these little things from the popularity of conversational podcasts to escape rooms point to our desire for questing and questioning and learning through conversation and learning with other people. So, but that brought us to the question, how much time do we actually spend practicing conversational learning as adults, and why don't we actually do it more often, given that we do have this innate desire to converse and learn through conversation, and we see that in children. That's, we are, it's I think we could argue it's pretty innate to our species. And we were talking, right, that obviously we seem to be all strapped for time, because time is money, and we feel like we need to. And we had this conversation before in past episodes. What do we do with the time the technology is saving? So yeah,
time and space.
time and space, which is needed also to develop that intimacy and trust in our relationships, so that we can have this sort of relationships.
Yeah, and I mean, coming back to like kids naturally want, they want to engage in a conversation. They've got a question, and we were talking about this a few days ago, just on, kids are wanting, they've always got loads of questions when it's bedtime. Whether an intentional tactic to stay up because you're imposing some arbitrary kind of time to go to bed, but they naturally want to question, engage in conversational learning, and that, I think, that to a large extent supports that kind of social brain hypothesis that is essentially about that the complexity of human cognition was largely to manage social relationships and interactions. Our social nature is inherent to this, and
it's a feature.
Yeah, it's a feature and a bug, and a bug and a feature at the same time, which is wonderful. But yeah, the time and space aspects, like, conversation takes time. Like, it's not, because it meanders, because we go on tangents, because we bring up anecdotes like we have in this conversation, that non-linear aspect means that it takes a little bit more time to unpack and connect different things because of those tangents and personal anecdotes and the storytelling that's part of it. And we're time poor, and we don't have our social spaces, like our spaces aren't designed for conversation. Our built environments aren't necessarily designed for social interaction in any significant way. So yeah, time and space, be that in our personal kind of social lives, or like our social lives as part of our work.
Which is interesting, because research shows all over again, and we know we're a social species, and we actually do our best work when we are allowed to work together and collaborate. But then we have our workplaces and even offices, if we're talking about like design of physical spaces, are not really often designed for collaboration. And at work, there's also, this expectation of separating the personal from professional, and, like, let's focus on just getting the job done, as the saying goes. So it's interesting. And especially we look at the trend of something like return to office mandates now that make the argument, oh, we need to share a space together to collaborate well, which, yes, is absolutely true. But then when you look at how work, in quotes, gets done, people return to the office and they sit at their own individual desks, each in their own individual Zoom calls with people who are not present, right? So it doesn't really make sense. So if you have that work culture and you have a lot of whiteboards in your office and you spend a lot of time, yes, actually collaborating and doing conversational learning, then it makes sense. But most workplaces don't really allow the time and space to do that, because we have a job to get done. And similarly in our personal context, right? Because we are so stressed with our jobs that are forcing us to work in ways that are not natural for us humans. We are obviously exhausted when at the end of the day when we just try to relax, and so we fall in the passive consumer consumption role. And also the design of our personal lives has been kind of steering us towards more individual activities and forcing us to go through life as individuals with individual burdens. We don't really have that many shared roles or activities. There seems to be like an increasing to-do list of chores and dishes to be washed, right? And it's just overwhelming.
Mm.
So yeah, we you know we started talking, but that perhaps we also have a conversational learning crisis because we don't have these spaces and systems designed to support the way we actually uh, learn best. And
Mm.
um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and that
like
I mean that relates to the previous conversations in podcasts just on like the weird online spaces and the necessity for like we lack social infrastructure, because what like conversational learning happens with partners, um, and in this context we are talking about like the role of machine agents in being a part of that and how they might be a part of that and where um, these conversational type of interfaces might play a role in re helping us to relearn this important technique. But yeah, we don't have the like the spaces, like the time, and that's a really uh, crucial part of it. But yeah, we do still do yearn for a good yarn. Um, we want to even I think, and this is I guess interesting. You come home from your long day working in some job that you don't fucking like, and you're bloody exhausted, and you've got social anxiety, or like you've got anxieties because of finances and like bills and futures like concerning because of all the crap you read on the news. And um, so that yearning for a yarn is probably going to be more to kind of offload and find like empathy and engage in some kind of reflection on your process, like so a much more kind of cathartic and therapeutic approach to conversation. But that's actually the power of conversation when you can
and
use it for things like that.
maybe for our non-Aussie listeners, if you can share a bit more about yarning and explain yarning,
Yeah,
because not
yeah, it's
everyone might be
not
familiar
not
with
a
that.
familiar term,
Yeah.
a yarn. Yarning is a uh, traditional way that First Nations people here in Australia have used to engage in everything from making decisions collectively as a group. Like, so it's usually done in a circle, or always done in a circle. Reasons for creating a space and being in a circle is because it changes the hierarchy. Like when you're sitting in a circle, doesn't matter who's talking, like you're usually talking, able to express yourself to everyone. So it creates a very different dynamic when everyone's sitting in a circle and having a yarn. Um, and yeah, so the oral storytelling and the expression of their LORE law and eh, the way that they would make collective decisions as kind of groups. So it's a very core part of First Nations people's way of relating and making decisions collectively and expressing and making sense of of their world and their relationality. Um, so yeah, that's I guess an ancient technology, that has been used for tens of thousands of years by First Nations people. But you'd see that there's corollaries to everywhere else. Like we regularly talk about sitting around the campfire, right? When you sit around the
Yeah.
campfire, it's generally in a circle. Yes, the fire's at the center, and that whole process is important. And then you've got things like the in yarning circles, there's a process of people taking turns and everyone being able to kind of express themselves. There's kind of an equity in that process. But even in other First Nations and Indigenous cultures, traditional cultures, you've got that. And then there's talking sticks, or Costa Rica, and when I went to kind of Costa Rica and Ecuador, you'd sit in these circles and you'd pass around tobacco, and tobacco was that it was your turn to speak, right? You'd have a puff on the tobacco, and that meant that you could actually talk at that time. So I think those oral traditions are really ancient, but again, reinforcing this idea that dialogue and engaging in conversation in pairs and in larger groups is just such a natural way for us to learn.
But it's interesting, we also see this in design of modern spaces, because there's some research that shows that parliaments who have a circular design actually leads to more, well, collaborative sense making and decision making, as opposed to the design of these like parliaments that sit on opposing sides, or like face each other, and you have like a physical representation of opposing sides. So a circle is, and that's why I think a lot of the spaces in the UN and the European Commission and things like that now, they're trying to incorporate more circles, because it's a more even equal way of talking to each other. And if we think back of our conversation in classrooms mostly are still of having one expert, or even when we go to conferences, it's experts sitting on a stage and then like the audience facing the expert. It's not a space that really invites conversation in a circle. But we do have examples even in modern spaces and modern architecture where circles can be used to encourage that conversation and give people the ability to face each other, right? And really engage with each other. And a circle certainly invites everyone to contribute more, which is, if we do an interesting juxtaposition to the way we interact with computers mostly, and most of our bureaucracies, is through web forms, right? These boxes, and most of the computer interfaces have been boxes, right? Because it's obviously easier to draw a box on a screen with pixels. Although that's now changing. Finally, we have high resolution screens, and it's easier now to draw circles and other organic shapes. But most of modern life, we could argue, has been boxed and standardized for, just as we do education, for efficiency, for scale. And obviously we also have quite a text-based culture, and thinking about maybe the roles also computers play in this trend of having our data in like a standardized machine readable format, and linear, and having pages that's on screen that we write on that invite linear thinking. So it's also been something that the limitations and the design technology encourage us to do. And a perfect example of our box life, standardized bureaucratic life, I think, is the game you're developing, the Ministry of Futility, which invite anyone to play test, because it's I think a perfect distillation of the lunacy of our text box based society.
that is exemplified in bureaucracy and checking boxes and filling out forms and different versions of forms, and the brutalist architecture of government buildings. And we've created those modern kind of complex institutions for lots of different reasons that evolved over time, particularly over the past couple of 100 years, primarily catalyzed through the Enlightenment period and separation of moving away from religious ways of seeing the world and the divine right of kings. And there's kind of boxes, like we've got got these screens and there's I guess that form meets the functional elements as well, and the constraints having circle interfaces and circular elements doesn't necessarily match the form of our screens either. So I think, yeah, but it is really interesting, like the physical aspects. As soon as you move away from squares, rectangles, and hierarchies in triangles to circles, move from those approaches to circles, in physical spaces, in the design of physical spaces, it changes behavior, um, uh, purely because of that dimensional orientation, which I think is a really important reflection point, for, yes, that's very relevant in physical spaces, but also I think in our digital spaces as well.
Yeah, exactly. In human-computer interaction, and yeah, this is perhaps where we see the opportunity for this conversational interfaces, right? LLMs, especially through voice modality, is to essentially, help us again interact and have conversation in ways that feel more natural, because in some sense text-based interactions are probably quite exhausting for humans, and we spend, you know as knowledge workers, we spend most of our days in these text-based conversations, either through Slack, Microsoft Teams, or emails, and we're all so exhausted. And even though we have all these tools to manage our knowledge, organize our knowledge, what we're finding is that people are craving a conversation. And even though we always try to have a single source of truth for our knowledge, what happens is that people just keep emailing or slacking the same questions all over again, probably because they just want to talk to a human, right, and have a conversation, and because we're craving that interaction. And even when we think about other conversational interfaces that we have, like social media or group chat,
Hmm.
they have their problems too. And social media, what you see and what you're rewarded for is driven by an algorithm. In closed communities, we are just overwhelmed by the amount of text and our attention, and it's hard to have these conversations through text. And I think you and I are people who enjoy reading a lot, writing a lot, but still we find it much easier, right? If you want to have meandering explorations and conversation learning like we do on like this podcast, it's much easier to just, get together in a room and have a voice-based conversation.
Hmm. Yeah, I
So
regularly yearn for a yarn.
yeah.
That's a and I think that the multimodality nature of the LLMs and how they're kind of advancing is also really interesting in terms of the visual sense, like the advanced voice mode. You know, I'm having this conversation with advanced voice mode yesterday, and hanging out the washing while I'm doing it, and engaging in a bunch of things. And I've got my headphones in, and kind of moving around, and I'm engaging in this fluid conversation. And my wife is, at her kind of desk doing some studying for her degree, and she's obviously heard me. And when I came inside, she's like, "Who are you? Who are you talking to?" Right? I was like, I'm talking to ChatGPT, right? So to the observer, just hearing me speak, it seemed supernatural, right? Like
Yeah.
the way that it was back and forth and tangents, the non-linear nature of it, like interruptions and things like that. So I think they're still pretty buggy, these interfaces, but it does mimic these more natural ways of learning. I think oral-based, voice-based conversations as opposed to text do come closer to that natural way of learning. And I think the sand talk reference here is really fascinating as a way to kind of think about this. And for those of our listeners, many of our listeners are likely familiar with Tyson Younger Porter's work, and in his book Sand Talk. But this idea that like all you need is to kind of sit, I don't know, sit around in a circle, or with have a yarn with people and have a stick and draw in the sand. Like simple ways of communicating are actually the most effective ways of communicating. So I think like sketch noting and things like that, that are incorporated into conversations, and we use Mural a lot, and we reflected on this yesterday, that like we wouldn't have been able to engage in the learning together over the past few years, if it wasn't for these tools. Like we are literally doing the modern version of Sand Talk without the sand, because Ali's in Slovenia and I'm here in Australia. So I think the comparison is interesting, and the multimodal trajectory of these tools is also going to be quite fascinating too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because voice certainly is a different way of making sense of the world, because it invites your entire body to participate. Because when you're typing and interacting through text, you it's such like a mediated experience. So you're pressing these little keys to make words appear, and it doesn't quite capture and doesn't engage your body fully. Even if you deaf people use ASL, the sign language, right? And it's like a fully embodied experience, and so different. And it's interesting that we have so much research, right, that shows us how we learn and make sense of the world, but we keep almost ignoring it, because we know there's research that shows that we actually learn more when we're writing by hand, in comparison to typing, because it engages your fine motor skills. Even if you use that text interface, if you actually hold a pencil to write, you actually help your memory encoding and you learn better. So bringing in your entire body, and that's what I think we've been struggling with, especially as more of our work became mediated through computers, that you have to use a keyboard, a mouse, and it doesn't really engage your body in the same sense. So it, in some sense, it feels that now digital technologies are finally catching up with our natural ways of learning, and learning through conversation, whether it's through advanced voice mode tools like Mural that allow us to send talk and imitate, um, having an actual physical whiteboard. And we know, even in work context, right, if you really want to collaborate well in an office, there's no better technology than a whiteboard that everyone can contribute to. And in classrooms we also have that, although it's usually just the teacher, the expert, writing, and sometimes you get to ask to come to the whiteboard, right, and write something as a student. But it's like such an awkward experience, because then everyone's just like staring at you. uh, but we know all these things, and even in classrooms, for some reason, or if you go to conferences, we then have gotten into habit of presenting and reading slides instead of actually actively engaging our bodies, and turning that learning experience opportunity into a collaborative, full embodied experience, right? But yeah, it's interesting, especially talking about voice mode. And I think until this year we didn't really have convincing natural sound, interfaces that feel natural.
Yeah, Siri was not a very good
Yes, it's not
benchmark for people.
Yeah.
Nor was kind of Alexa in that sense either. So like the advancements are like amazing. The fact that I'm having this conversation with ChatGPT, my wife literally thinks that I'm talking to a person.
Yeah.
That's very different from, "Hey Siri." which most of those interactions are like again, it's that interface that we're familiar with, where we've got a task, we've got a query. Hey Siri, can you create a calendar event for tomorrow at 3:30 so that I can I don't know, have an appointment or with X or do something, right? Like they're not conversations. Um,
Yeah.
so I think the full extent of voice-based interfaces is yet to be realized, and just the throughput that we get it through voice is just, it's very different. Like as an interface, the speed at which we can think doesn't necessarily always match the way how fast we can talk, but that's very different. Even if you're a fast typer,
Yeah.
the throughput that you get from how you think to what you write and what you respond with is there's a lot of delay.
Yeah. I also found the anecdote you mentioned about your son trying out voice mode, and he said like that he traversed so many different
Ah,
subjects in just like a half an hour, right?
it was a classic example of that kids naturally learning through asking questions and curiosity driven, right? And I think the interesting part is, I'm not as knowledgeable in that sense as uh, ChatGPT. Despite its the percentage of kind of hallucinatory responses that you're going to get from ChatGPT, you can still draw on this extraordinary knowledge. So it's like my son is there talking to a really knowledgeable, learned polymath that can explain everything from animals and reptiles to mythology and TV shows, and so he went from talking about things like frogs and dinosaurs to talking about One Piece and Monkey D. Luffy and the TV, his favorite TV shows and Minecraft and things like that. But that was a really good example of how conversation, and he would have learned and compressed a whole bunch of things, connected a lot of different dots, and all these different neural pathways that are kind of opening up and all, which is a really important point, that conversational learning really engages the neuroplasticity that is essential for learning. Like our brains and bodies are designed for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, is technology finally catching up to humans? Are we, as we say, coming
Coming
full
full
circle?
circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
um,
circles,
and
importance
circles.
in circles.
But it
And I,
seems, our guiding question, why aren't more people using conversational interfaces for conversational learning? And we did identify quite a lot of blockers through our conversations, from mental models and how we have used technology in the past, and also how we have been conditioned to learn through formal education systems, um, from the lack of time and space. But we don't want to now promise or frame LLMs and AI chatbots as a solution for everything. Obviously, they have their flaws and problems, from the starting just from the amount of resources they use. But maybe, right? Maybe they can remind us what it's like to conversationally learn, but we will have to encourage each other to use these tools for other purposes other than productivity and just getting quick answers, because they are not search engines. And so, yeah, I recently also wrote a blog post with some examples of how I have try to have conversations with LLMs. If anyone is interested in, or inspired to just try to have a bit conversations actually with AI chatbots
it's a
rather than just,
conversational guide, not a prompt
yeah,
engineering guide, which is
exactly. That's why I think the language we use, right, is a bit misleading, because even the word AI assistant, it can be an assistant, but can also be a lot more. It can be a teacher, it can be an editor, it can play so many different roles, and so can you as the user. You can also be an assistant to to the AI. You can be a teacher, you can be a student. You can really change roles and engage in conversation through different lenses and by playing different roles. So
Mm.
that's what we would like people to encourage people to try out for themselves. Because, I mean, one advantage that AI chatbots have is that they're always available in your pocket, probably on your phone. So even if you're doing some chores, washing dishes, or whatever, folding laundry, you can just have a conversation and see how it goes and start practicing. Not just so we can have just better conversations with LLMs, obviously, but so you can then hopefully have better conversations with the humans in your life.
Yeah, and importantly, that availability aspect is crucial because the humans, the people that we have, the people that we love, the people that are in our social lives, they're not always available.
Yeah.
You can't always pick up the phone and call your friend and your brother or sister or your mother or your mentors or whatever it might be. So there's there's uh, an opportunity here to enhance our conversational learning through these tools, while also factoring in the recognition of the impact that these technologies are having on the environment, usage of water, like the supply chain of materials, but also the other ethical considerations around being mindful that you are building a relationship with these tools as you use them like this, the subtle use of language, the anthropomorphization that we do, the fact that it's engaging our brains in these ways that is inherently wired from our evolution, does create a bunch of dangers and risks in terms of the type of relationship that we deal with these technologies. Um, so, caveat with all those things, but I think encouraging people to play is, yeah, a big part of the message that we have here.
Yeah, and playing together. So not just playing with your LLM, but as we said in the previous episode, finding a fellowship and playing together with other humans.
The fellowship of the circle.
Yeah, and moving away from boxes and towards circles, conversational circles, yearning circles, learning circles.
Ne-
Um,
Next time, I think our murals are a good example of the meandering, connecting, non-linear approaches to conversations. We start with a guiding question, we unpack it, we explore different topics. There's different tangents. Our mural doesn't necessarily represent all the nuance, the warm data that's there in the conversations on the full moon gatherings, but again, conversation is a powerful method of learning. And Ali, I always learn so much from engaging in conversations with you. So thank you. And yeah, to our listeners, thank you for listening.
yeah, and come play with us and explore with us. You're all invited to join our full moon gathering or send us your thoughts. But while you were saying, and I feel the same way as you do about our conversations, and whenever I give myself the time and space to have this type of conversations, whether it's with an LLM or preferably a human, it's interesting that we often say the phrase, well, we got to think outside the box, right? I was just reminded of that. Yet we keep trapping ourselves into boxes in our um, digital interfaces. We keep designing these boxes, we keep designing forms. So yeah, maybe that's the kind of takeaway we can have from these episodes to
Yeah,
not just think outside the boxes, but actually move outside the boxes and
move
leave
outside
the
the box.
boxes behind, because we as a species, as a planet, we are facing quite a lot of big challenges, and I think we need more circles to face them.
I absolutely agree. Circles circles all the way down, fractal circles, intersecting circles, mandalas everywhere. Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Circles all the way down. I think that that's a good point to wrap up this conversation. So embrace the circles, leave the boxes behind. Let your cats play with the boxes. You're a human. Embrace the circle.
Yes.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening and pathfinding with us. If you enjoyed this exploration, share it with friends to inspire further discussions. Leave a review, comment, or send us your thoughts at community@ethics.co. We're always happy to hear from you. And we're also extremely grateful to our paid subscribers on Substack who are able to support our work financially. We hope to continue inspiring collective pathfinding towards better tech futures, and every bit of support, whether financial or algorithmic, helps to keep us going. We invite you to embrace the lunacy of tech with smiles and love by subscribing to the Pathfinder's new newsletter and joining our next full moon gathering. We sing our monthly reflections and gatherings to the lunar cycle as a reminder of our place in the universe and a commonality we share across time zones and places we inhabit. Pathfinder's podcast will return during the next waning moon. Until then, make time for deep conversations that nourish your soul, and be mindful about the seeds of intention you plant and the stories you tell. There's magic in both.